Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, hey friends, thank you so much for being with us today on the Kingdoms Podcast. I'm really grateful to have joining me from Vancouver, BC, Ken Shigematsu. Ken, thanks so much for being on today.
Thanks, Luke. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, Ken, it's as we were saying before we hit the record button, I've been really blessed by your book, which has been out for almost a decade now, God in My Everything. And I feel like I'd heard the title, but it wasn't until recently that I was listening to a podcast where someone said, this book has profoundly shaped my life. And I thought, I've got to read it. And then I started reading it and I thought, I've got to take the opportunity to interview Ken. So you may have heard, if you're a listener, you may have heard of the book, God in My Everything. And we have Ken to thank for that. So in a moment, we're actually going to dive into that a little bit more and really hear from Ken some insights on some of the different elements related to personal spiritual formation that he talks about there. But Ken, for listeners who maybe don't know you as well, who would love to learn how you became a pastor and an author, I'd love for you to give us a bit of a background snapshot, if you will, to your journey to pastoral ministry. I found it quite remarkable. You were born in Japan, raised in Canada. You've worked and studied in multiple countries on multiple continents, and now you're serving as a pastor at 10th Church in Vancouver. So how did that whole trajectory not only shape you, but in the process, how did you meet Jesus and then step into the calling that you're part of today?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Luke. So as you indicated, I'm originally from Japan, but when I was about 2 years old, our family moved briefly to New York City and then to London, England. My dad worked as a broadcaster for the BBC. And then when I was about 8, we moved to Vancouver. And when I was in my teen years, I was getting into some trouble. I was shoplifting, engaging in some small-time drug dealing at my high school, joyriding, borrowing cars from the local car repair shop before I was old enough to legally drive.
Wow.
And so my dad, who was this very upright, conservative Japanese man, was very concerned. And so he took me on a little field trip to one of the local prisons. And afterwards, he said, Ken, I just wanted you to see your future home, courtesy of my tax dollars.
Wow.
Well, that didn't, quote, scare me straight. And so my dad, who had been raised a nominal Buddhist, but had come to know Jesus, took me to a Christian youth conference here in Vancouver. And for the first time, I heard that Christ died on the cross so that I could be forgiven, so that I could have a new start. And even though I was having quite a bit of fun, shoplifting and joyriding and so forth, using and selling drugs, I knew that my life was headed in the wrong direction. And so when I heard that Christ could give me a new beginning, I thought, this is an opportunity too good to pass up. So I committed my life to Christ.
Yeah.
And a couple of years later, I was at a Christian summer camp not far from Vancouver. And the speaker was an Argentinian-born evangelist named Luis Palau.
Yes.
Yeah, so you've heard of Luis Palau.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I was part of the youth group of this camp. And we were supposed to go water skiing one night, but the ski boat broke down. And so all the teenagers had to go to hear the adult speaker, Luis Palau. And he spoke passionately about his desire to reach Latin America with the gospel in different parts of the world. And I remember being very moved by that message and inspired and going back to our lodge and getting down on my knees and saying, Lord, I'm available to you if you want me to work in your harvest fields in a quote full-time capacity. It's my vocation. I'm available. And I ended up going to university studying business economics, went off to Tokyo and worked at the Sony Corporation for a couple of years. But in the back of my mind, I thought, God may be calling me to vocational ministry. So eventually I became a pastor here in Vancouver.
Wow. That was an excellent synopsis, but also so many rich, significant moments in that. But thank you for highlighting that with us. And between Canada and the United States and England and Japan, obviously you've had just a plethora of cross-cultural experiences. And I'm intrigued to know, Ken, currently in your work as a pastor, how have you maybe interwoven some of those experiences, kind of bringing those cross-cultural moments, relationships, observations together in the way that you lead and serve in what is a very diverse city in Vancouver?
Yeah, you mentioned the word diversity, Luke. So
Mm,
some years ago, there were a couple of authors from the States who came to visit our church, and they
mm,
were wanting to write a little profile on me and how I engaged change at our church.
mm.
It used to be almost exclusively white Anglo-Saxon senior citizens, and the
Yeah.
authors came and they looked around and they said, we've never seen this kind of diversity, not just ethnically and racially, but socioeconomically at a church in the United States. And so they said, how did this happen? And
Mm,
I said, I don't know. There was no really intentional strategy. And the author started asking me about my background. And I said, well,
mm.
I was born in Japan, as I mentioned. We moved to New York City when I was young, England, to Vancouver, Canada when I was 8, went to Chicago to go to university, Tokyo to work for Sony, went to Boston to go to seminary, ended up heading to California to help start a church with a friend, and then back to Vancouver.
Mm.
And the author said, well, where do you feel really at home? And I said, well, I don't really feel completely at home anywhere. I'm a
Yeah.
racial minority in Vancouver. And
Mm,
even when I'm back in Japan, I noticed that I didn't quite fit in. I remember being on the subway at around midnight, and the subway car was fairly empty. So I took off my suit jacket, sort of tossed it beside me, and then just sort of stretched out my arms on the subway bench. And I noticed people staring at me. They didn't say anything. Japanese people are too polite, but they just
mm.
sort of stared at me coolly and quizzically. And later I read a book called Japanese Society by Chie Nakane. And I recognized that because space in Japan is at such a premium, even if
Mm.
you're all alone on the subway or almost all alone, you economize your space, personal space.
Wow.
So yeah, and so I said, yeah, I don't think I feel at home completely anywhere. And one of the authors said, well, here's what I think you're doing here at 10th, because you've never felt completely at home anywhere. You're setting a table where everybody is welcome.
Yeah.
And so I think that's been part of the gift of living in different places and never feeling completely at home anywhere. I long to create a space where everyone feels welcome no matter what their background.
Yeah. As a third culture kid myself, I resonate with that. And there's something really beautiful and sometimes painful in that process of not necessarily feeling one place is home. But I think the beauty is, as you said, there's a genuine desire to say, how can we set the table and invite everyone to be here for that? And yeah, I mean, I'm in Ontario, but I've heard of the beauty and the diversity that your church is known for. So, man, praise God for that and God bless you for that, because that's a really healthy example, I think, for the church today. Actually, it ties in with what, the next question I wanted to ask you, Ken, because, many people's eyes are focused on what's been taking place in the Middle East. We think of regional conflicts in nations like Syria, for example, more recently Afghanistan, and thousands of men and women and children fleeing those countries and looking to different European countries or even countries like Canada or the United
Mhm.
States as a place of refuge, as a new home. And so I really believe it's the providence of God that He's bringing
Mhm.
the nations to our neighborhoods, almost to our doorsteps, that the church has a beautiful and compelling opportunity in this day and age, in this time in history. And so I wonder, given your experiences, Ken, given what your church has enjoyed in diversity, what would you consider the best ways that the church in the West can respond to immigrants with welcome, with support, and with friendship?
Yeah, Luke, you make some good points. As we look at the Bible, we see that God had a heart not just for the descendants, the physical descendants of Abraham, but for the foreigner among them,
Mm,
the alien, the disenfranchised. And
mm,
so we see that heart also in Jesus Christ as He connects with outsiders like the Samaritan woman. So this is really God's heart. Luke, you just mentioned the word God's providence. Ray Bakke, an urban missiologist, spoke at our church some years ago. And he said, partly tongue in cheek, partly joking, just when it was getting too expensive to send missionaries overseas, God has sent the world to Vancouver at their own expense. And to
Hey, yeah.
Canada, you could have said to places like Barrie, Ontario, or wherever.
Mm,
And so I think that we need to be aware of the providence of God in allowing migrants to come to our country. And so here's
mm,
a recent story. Luke, I can't get into the details because I can't compromise someone's personal safety.
understandable.
But there's a young woman that I'm thinking of that was
Mm,
in Afghanistan,
mm,
and she received a scholarship to study at a medical school in the United States, a school that you would recognize.
mm,
And when the war broke out in Afghanistan um, and the violence with the Taliban, the university, the medical school rescinded both the admission offer as well as the scholarship for
wow.
this young Afghan woman. But she had the original letter of admission. So she was
Mm,
able to get a visa. She was very brave, flew to the United States, and somehow made her way up to a little town called Blaine, Washington, which is just across the border from Canada, just
mm,
south of Vancouver. She walked across the Peace Arch border and then ended up living with six guys. It was not a very safe situation. She ran out of money. They kicked her out. And she was walking through a park, essentially homeless that
mm,
first day. And she ran into a couple of Afghan women. And they asked about her. She began pouring out her heart.
mm,
And the Afghan women looked at each other and they said, "You should contact Mim Wickett from 10th Church.
mm.
He's a woman in our community that has a real heart to welcome refugees." And so they got connected that night. And then someone else connected to our community had previously offered their condo here in Vancouver free of charge for
Wow.
refugees.
Mm,
And so I think that when it comes to welcoming refugees, we need to be attuned to what God is providentially doing in bringing them to Canada, as you mentioned,
mm,
and then to see if God might lead us to open our hearts to create space for
mm,
refugees in our own lives through friendships like Mim and others are doing. And then if we have the capacity or the connections to see if we can facilitate housing for them, because many of them obviously are displaced and looking for homes. And it can also help to connect with the refugee ministry. We
mm.
partner with some organizations, including Journey Home, which
Yep.
specializes in some of the practicalities of helping to process the court cases of
Mm,
refugees.
mm. Wow, man, that, yeah, you talk about courage. That's, I can only imagine leaving Afghanistan, crossing the border, but also the beauty of finding a church family to support
Mm.
and to help you, yeah, take that next step in life, especially when you've overcome so much. That's huge. But thank you for that, Ken. I think, yeah, I think it's so valuable for our church members and followers of Jesus to be asking those kind of questions. How would God use my life, my resources, my availability to embrace men and women from around the world who, yeah, who are coming to our shores? It's a beautiful opportunity, but it's an opportunity we don't want to miss. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know earlier, Ken, when I was talking at the intro, I was sharing about your book, God and My Everything, which actually came out in 2013. And I know I said to you, I only recently discovered it. And actually, it was through engaging with pastors who are really invested in spiritual formation, men like Rich Villodas and John Mark Comer, who have leaned into your work. And so for listeners who maybe have heard of those two men and their names, Ken's somebody whose insights and whose own journey has really influenced them. And so that's really why I'm excited to kind of pivot with you in our conversation and take some time to look at some of the content from that text. I know that if we were to take the 50,000 foot view to start, writing God in My Everything, you're celebrating this ancient Christian practice of having a rule of life, which for many people is a baffling statement. So could you give us just the 50,000 foot view to start? What is a rule of life? And what role does such a rule play in a person's spiritual formation?
Sure. And if I can just step that question back a little bit and give you some context.
Sure. Yeah.
When I was working in Tokyo, Luke, I was what they call the 7-11 man. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that expression, but it basically meant that my workday went from 7 in the morning until 11 at night, sometimes even later. So
Man.
things were pretty crazy back then.
Yeah.
I eventually, as I mentioned, became a pastor here in Vancouver, and I thought things would finally settle down for me. But I found myself keeping almost as busy.
Mm.
I was making so many visits to the Wendy's drive-through window at midnight that the person behind the glass came to recognize me. And then,
It's Ken.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
yeah, and right around this crazy busy time, my mentor, Leighton Ford, the
Mm.
brother-in-law to the late Billy Graham,
Wow.
invited me to join him on a pilgrimage to the holy places of Ireland. I'd never been to Ireland. Obviously, that's not, quote, the old country for me, but I
Mm.
was eager for a change of pace and a change of scenery.
Mm.
And so we head off and we visit some of the ancient monasteries of Ireland.
Yes.
And we learn about this way of life that the monks describe as a, quote, rule of life.
Mm.
It's a rhythm of life that would enable them to experience God, not just as they were on their knees praying in a chapel,
Mm.
but as they were working out in the fields, as they were studying in a library, as they were preparing a meal in a kitchen. And I was hungry for God in every part of my life.
Yeah.
I wanted to feed on God in every part of my life. And so when I got home, I began to put into practice some of the simple habits I learned from the monks, what they call
Mhm.
a rule of life. We can call it a rhythm of life. And these habits went on to change my life. And the word you paused when you mentioned the word rule, and I think you sensed that that might push some people back and cause some people to hesitate. But the word rule comes from the ancient root word trellis. And a
Mm.
trellis, as folks may know if they've visited a vineyard, whether in Ontario or BC or Napa Valley or somewhere else, is simply a
Mm.
structure that supports a grapevine,
Mm.
enabling it to receive more sunlight, to be pruned and guided in its growth,
Yeah.
so that it produces better fruit and therefore better wine.
Mm.
And a rule of life is simply a trellis that supports our life with God, a way of life that supports our life with God, so that we experience more of the sunlight of Jesus in our lives, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so we bear more of his love, joy, peace. And yeah, I desperately need more of that. And maybe your friends on this podcast do as well.
I do too. Yeah. But that's an excellent insight. And so yeah, I do pause when you're right when I say the rule. I think we can sometimes cringe at that, but it's a really healthy structure, committed discipline, if you will. Is that fair to say? That's intended to over time steadily form and shape us to be like Jesus, really in all the main spheres of life. Is that fair to say, Ken?
Yeah, it's basically a way of life, a rhythm of life
Mm.
that supports our life with God, our
Yeah.
most important life-giving relationship of all, and our most important human relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that front, it's really well organized. Your text, you tackle some key areas and kind of moving progressively through different themes. And I know you talk about some of these quote root practices, if you will. You touch on Sabbath and prayer and sacred reading. And while we don't have time to dive into all the practices you underscore, I'd love to specifically look at prayer in this element. And you highlight the practice of examine, the prayer of examine. Could you describe what that practice is, but also its role in the life of a Jesus follower, the application of that, if you will, in their everyday lives?
Yeah, so the prayer of examine was introduced to us by Saint Ignatius of Loyola about
Mm.
500 years ago.
Mm.
And this prayer basically invites us to look back over the last day or week or month, a period of time, and to identify the things for which we are grateful to God for, the
Mm.
things that drew us to God, beauty. Um, it might even be something difficult, but gave us a deeper awareness of God's presence and grace in our lives. And so at the end of the day, I will look back over the day and give thanks to God for two or three things. So if I were to do that, say, today, I would look back and I would say, I'm thankful that I had an opportunity to go on a run with our golden retriever, Sasha.
Mm.
I'm working from home as I am quite a bit during COVID. I'm thankful for a good lunch at home,
Mm.
a favorite Japanese dish called nikujaga, and a
Mm.
good conversation with my wife, and thankful for the opportunity to talk to you, Luke. And so these may be really simple, but the research coming out of places like Harvard point out that if you'll take 3 to 5 minutes to savor a few gifts from the day that you're thankful for, it will change the way you move through the world.
Mm,
So, for example, my colleague, Edlin, whom you've been in touch with,
mm.
she was in the market for an Austin Mini Cooper,
Ooh,
one of those small British cars. And
yeah.
so after she started to think about buying one, she began to notice these little British cars everywhere
Mm,
in Vancouver. It wasn't like the dealer said, oh, she's on the fence, we're going to flood her neighborhood and her work area with these little cars. It's just that she was primed to think about them, and therefore she noticed them.
mm,
And when we are engaged in a Thanksgiving habit, we're going
mm.
to be primed to notice the good things coming into our life. It'll seem like more good things are coming into our existence, even though
Yeah.
that may not be the case, objectively speaking. And as we identify those good things with God's goodness to us,
Mm.
we'll be more grateful, we'll feel more connected to God, and we'll have more joy.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's beautifully put. And to be honest, it's something, yeah, in part because of your work that I started practicing the prayer of examine. And along with those rhythms of gratitude, to be able to almost just quiet your heart before resting. I notice that the nights that I forget to do that, I often am much more restless than the nights that I kind of bring everything from my life and my day, as you said, in gratitude to God. So valuable and so good. Maybe to continue, Ken, you underscore in the next segment of your book, healthy friendships, God honoring sexuality, and committed family relationships in our formation as Jesus followers. And so to maybe zero in specifically on friendship and true, robust, not just like I followed you on Instagram and we sent each other a short text that said hi once, but real committed friendship, in a time when it can be easy to settle for virtual relationships. And when countless people are really content with that, either in their friendships or also in their faith communities, I wonder, what does it look like for people to foster authentic, real, in-person, spiritually formative friendships?
Yeah, that's a great question, Luke. InterVarsity here in Canada did a study some years ago that you may be familiar with. And they discovered that the singular most important factor in determining whether a young person continues in their Christian faith once they finish school
Mm,
is whether they have some friends who will walk with them who share a common faith.
yeah.
And so it's really important for our faith. It's also important for our well-being. During COVID, a higher percentage of people in Canada and around the world have reported feeling anxious and depressed.
Mm,
And the data shows that there's just one thing that unites the top 10% of the happiest people in the world. And it's not
mm,
your income, it's not your level of education, your social class, your race, even your physical health, or
mm,
the climate that you're living in. It's the quality of your relationships. So
yeah. Yeah.
friendships are beneficial spiritually, but in every way. And it's important. It's going to sound like a cliche, but to prioritize friendships,
Mm,
part of the gift of the rule of life, the rhythm of life that the monks talk about and that you've alluded to in my book, is that we're invited to practice Sabbath,
mm,
ideally 24 hours once a week. And even if we tend to be a workaholic by nature, and we feel like our work is never done,
mm,
if we embrace a Sabbath day, we have time to connect to God, connect to those things that make us
mm,
feel most alive, whether it's for me running through a trail in the woods with our dog, or for others, it might be listening to gorgeous music or watching an inspiring film. But we also have time to connect with the most important people in our lives, whether it's family or friends. And you mentioned Instagram before and connecting by um, social media. The temptation for a lot of people is to show, as other people have observed, their highlight reel.
yes.
But the key to friendship, going deeper, is to share our weaknesses. Jim
Mm,
Houston is a spiritual theology professor here in Vancouver who started a school called Regent College. And he says that true friendship is based on mutual shared weakness.
mm,
And so to have someone that it'll take time, that we trust enough to disclose not only our victories and our successes, but where we feel insecure, where we failed, our hopes and dreams. And so each
yeah.
week I try to connect with my good friend Mark. It happens to be because he lives in a different city, via Zoom. Um, but we take time. It sounds really heavy, but to confess our temptations and our
Mm,
failings, and it sounds heavy, but a really uplifting experience, but also one that really bonds us to each other as friends and as brothers.
Yeah. You can be fully known and fully loved.
Mm-hmm.
That's so powerful. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And, yeah, I found that myself, that there was a season of life where I was preoccupied with people knowing what I was good at or accomplished in. And the most significant formation of my own life has come in the context of those relationships that are grounded in the gospel, but as you said, able to be honestly broken, honestly weak. And it's quite humbling and quite beautiful to see the way that God's strength sometimes emerges in our weakness in ways we could have never foreseen. So, yeah, to any listeners out there, as Ken has said, and even, you've mentioned, Ken, in your relationship with Mark, it is such a gift to have a trusted friend or friends that you can journey with in honesty and humility and joy and celebration and confession towards knowing God together. Uh, Ken, you uh, towards the end of your text, you highlight some really significant areas when it comes to our understanding of care for the body, play, the use of finance. And I'd love to zero in on what you wrote on the body. Part of this is my wife and I recently actually had a baby boy. And so that experience has gotten me thinking a lot about the incarnation and what it actually meant for Jesus to enter into this world and be born into this world and take on a human body and experience everything in the same way that we do in many ways. And so a quote that really jumped out at me from your book, you wrote this. You said, by becoming a flesh and blood human being in the person of Jesus Christ, God demonstrates that he values and honors the human body. If the human body were inherently evil, God never would have clothed himself in one. And so God's decision to take on a body, which is the Christian doctrine of the incarnation, is the highest affirmation of our physical bodies. And so, given God's tremendous value for the human body, what would you say are the implications for how we should steward our bodies, both for our own good, but also for God's glory?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. A lot of people, a lot of us can make a dichotomy between our body and our spirit, or our physical life and our spiritual life. But if we think about it, if we run our body down, if we're not getting enough sleep, or if we're not eating properly, we're going to be more tempted to self-medicate. And there's a difference between self-care and self-medication.
Right.
And if we're extremely physically tired, we'll find it hard to pay attention to God, to be attuned to his love for us. We'll find it harder to be patient with others. And so, Luke, you're going to be sleep deprived in all likelihood with a new baby boy. You don't be too hard on yourself. But you'll also find that if you don't get rest where you can, then you'll be less patient with your son and your wife. And some people think that self-care, caring for your body through sleep or through proper eating or exercise, is somehow selfish. But as Parker Palmer, whom I quote in God in My Everything, says, he's a Quaker elder, self-care is never a selfish act. It is the stewardship of the only gift you have to offer the world, which is the gift of yourself. And so, as you think about your own life, Luke, remember, even in these demanding days, that self-care is never a selfish act. It is the stewardship of the only gift you have to offer the world, including your newborn son.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And well said. Well said. Ken, there's been a ton of good things you've shared. There's been a ton more I would love to ask, but before we wrap things up in our conversation together, we just want to ask, is there anything you would add to what we've shared together today, whether about spiritual formation or welcoming people coming to our communities and injecting diversity into that? Is there anything else you'd add on that front before we wrap up our time?
Yeah, I would say, as I've been thinking about this, especially during the pandemic, and it relates to a rule of life or a rhythm of life. But Dallas Willard, the late professor of philosophy at the University of Southern California and the very perceptive writer on the spiritual life, once said, organize your life so that you are experiencing deep joy, contentment, and confidence in your everyday life with God.
Hmm.
And so that's really the essence of a rhythm of life or a rule of life, to structure your life such that you are experiencing deep joy, contentment, and
Hmm.
confidence in your everyday life with God. I'm in a pretty demanding role as a pastor of an urban church in the center of Vancouver.
Hmm.
We've actually got multiple sites now, but
Hmm.
I'm in a kind of role where I'm faced with crisis day after day in people's lives.
Yeah.
And some time ago, my wife in our kitchen said, "Ken, I think you're the happiest pastor I know."
Hmm.
She doesn't know that many pastors.
Still.
And uh, if there's any truth to that, if I experience joy, despite some of the challenges I face, it's partly because I've been blessed with an amazing family, some, as I alluded to, some incredible friends,
Hmm.
but it's also because I have this very simple rule of life, this trellis. It includes meditation and prayer. It includes spiritual friendship, which we've talked about. It includes
Yeah.
Sabbath. Um, that helps to connect me with my most life-giving, joy-evoking relationship of all, my relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And so it's my hope and prayer for everyone who's joining us today that they would know God is alive and real,
Yeah.
not just as they're having a quote quiet time or praying formally, but through a simple rhythm, that they would know God is alive and real in their work or studies, in their family life, their friendships, in their rest, and
Hmm.
even in their play, that they would know God in their everything.
Yeah. Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, Ken, if people are interested in picking up a copy of the book, if they want to learn more about you and the ministry they're part of, how can they do that?
Yeah, if they want to pick up a copy of the book, God in My Everything, How an Ancient Rhythm Helps Busy People Enjoy God, they can pick it up at
Mm.
Amazon or anywhere books are sold. Basically, they can order it. And just to let people know that 100% of all the proceeds from
Mm.
my book writing uh, uh, go to missions that support vulnerable children in
Wow.
places like Cambodia and other parts of the world. And so we've been able to give more than $400,000 away in book-related proceeds
Excellent.
to missions, especially in Cambodia,
Mm.
helping one of our mission partners put out buildings on what is becoming the first Christian camp in the history of Cambodia.
Wow.
And so they can pick up the book there. And I do some teaching occasionally on rule of life at
Mm.
our church, and they can tune into messages on our website at
Mm.
www.tenth.ca, tenth.ca.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Ken, thank you so much for writing that book. It's been really formative in my life and I know in countless lives. And thank you so much for this time here on the Kingdoms podcast.
You bet. Thanks for having me. It's been great to be with you.